As my mother said, I have been serving in Cambodia for the last 6.5 years, working primarily in the field of anti-human trafficking. Now, we are all here today because we are either involved in or seeking to be involved in mission, unless somebody just dragged you along and you had no idea what you were getting into. The word mission is broad and complex. As we've heard from many plenary speakers and workshop leaders thus far, there are a lot of different ways that people engage in mission. But if we had to summarize our role as missionaries, or as Christians for that matter, it would be to declare to the world that God exists, that He is good, and that He is seeking to be in relationship with each and every one of us. Now, in my opinion, and through the experiences that I've had, the biggest challenges to the world believing that God exists and that He is good are pain, suffering, tragedy, and trauma. As you know, I'm here today to talk about one of those major tragedies in our world, human trafficking. By definition, human trafficking is the illegal movement of human beings across real or imaginary borders. It's used primarily for the purpose of sexual exploitation or labor exploitation. But I think oftentimes, issues like this are better illustrated through narrative. So I want to tell you guys a story about a family that I know in Cambodia. Now, I'm not going to use their names, because protecting the identity and therefore the dignity of victims of injustice and trafficking is one of the greatest ways that we can serve them. But this is a story about a woman and her second husband and their 6 children who were living in a slum area in Phnom Penh called Summer Benton. Unlike many of the other families in this area, their family actually owned their land and their house on the land. But despite that land deed, on June 6th of 2006, bulldozers came and kicked them out of their home. They were piled in along with their neighbors into trucks, most without time to collect any of their belongings, and they were taken far outside the city into a resettlement community called Andong. Now, unlike Summer Benton, which was rather centrally located in Phnom Penh, Andong was many kilometers outside of the city. It had no clean water, no sanitation, no access to education for the children. And the parents didn't have transportation, so they couldn't get to and from work, and they eventually lost their jobs. This family was already very poor. They were living in a slum area. But they fell deeper and deeper into poverty, and they got desperate. Well, one day, some strangers came into their resettlement community and offered them an opportunity to make some money. They said that they could provide employment for their daughters if they sent them into the city with them. Well, the oldest daughter of the family at the time already had a family of her own, and so they sent their second oldest daughter, who was 15, back into Phnom Penh with these people. Now, as I'm sure many of you are already imagining, when she arrived in Phnom Penh, she was sold into a brothel. I met this young lady shortly after she was rescued by an incredible partner in the anti-trafficking movement, International Justice Mission. And while that rescue event was the end of unspeakable trauma and horror for her, and ultimately the beginning of her story of healing, the condition in her family didn't change. And shortly after her rescue, similar people came back to the village, and they recruited her 14-year-old brother to work on a fishing boat off of the coast of Thailand. Now, driven by an increasing global demand for seafood and very lax maritime labor laws, the conditions on these fishing boats off the coast of Thailand and the South China Sea are among the worst in the world. Praise be to God, this young boy was rescued only about a year later, and he's now back with his family. So by the time my work with this family began, they had already fallen victim to 3 different major types of injustice. Illegal land seizure or land grabbing, when their land was taken from them unjustly. sex trafficking when their daughter was sold into a brothel, and labor trafficking when their son was taken to work on a fishing boat. There are so many stories like theirs around the world. There are so many facts and statistics floating around about how many people are trafficked worldwide, which places are the most affected, and what we can do to stop it. Human trafficking is one of the biggest social issues in our world today. But I don't want to spend our time today by giving you a lot of statistics or telling you story after story that may sensationalize this tragedy for you. Because I want to spend our time today exploring some questions, some very important questions that we must consider as we seek to form a missional response to this issue. How can we believe that God exists when stories like this happen around us every day? How can we lead others to believe in God's goodness when they see and experience unspeakable tragedy? How can we introduce them to a God who is loving and good and encourage them to be in relationship with Him when they've lost everything? So stepping into a story like this, the story that I shared today, stepping in between the victim and the oppressor, is not a question about responding to a social issue, although it is a social issue. It's a question of whether or not we are going to make God known in every situation, whether or not we are going to battle the pain, the suffering, the tragedy all around us and declare to the world that God exists and that He is good. So the question is, as a church, as a body of Christ, are we courageous enough to step into these places? Are we courageous enough? And if we are, what do we do when we get there? Do we go, preach the gospel with our lips, and pass out Bibles? Maybe. If through our discernment, that's very clearly what God is telling us to do. But my challenge to you would be that our response likely needs to be a bit more complex than that. Many of us are pretty comfortable living in a verbal mission mentality, where we share the gospel verbally and look for a response verbally, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's also not always how people experience God. I want you all to take a minute and think about your weakest moment, the darkest days of your life. What did you need from God in that moment? It's likely that your answer to that question is pretty practical. Maybe you needed money. Maybe you needed a job. Maybe you needed a major obstacle in your life removed, or healing through an available yet expensive medical treatment. Maybe not. Maybe you've always had all of your earthly needs met, and what you needed was first simply deep spiritual revelation or enlightenment. Don't try to make everything fit inside boxes in our mind that make sense in our Western paradigm. Don't try and find somebody to blame. Blame evil, Satan, darkness, because that's the battle that we are called to fight our entire Christian lives. But while we are called to look at the reality of the pain, we shouldn't dwell in the tragedy. We shouldn't be paralyzed by it. That's what Satan wants. We need to move into seeking God's heart on this issue. We need to allow our hearts to be broken because God's heart is broken, not because we're afraid. We need to seek refuge in Him and in the goodness that He's promised to bring into this darkness. Only after we have a deep understanding of God's heart for injustice should we consider our response to God's call. Now, as I said before, our natural human response to pain and suffering is fear and self-protection. That's not what God wants. But we also can't combat that natural human response without a desperate connection to prayer. We can't face any of this without God, individually, as a small group, or as a church. God doesn't want us to act out of our own feelings. He wants us to be his hands and feet. Now, practically speaking, there are several areas of response that have been formed to issues like human trafficking. There are people that have gone out to rescue the victims. There are people seeking to bring justice to the oppressors through court systems and other things. And there are people like myself who are working to help facilitate healing for the survivors. There are tons of different responses and different resources. But ultimately, the best response to injustices and trafficking is to prevent it from happening in the first place. I'm going to turn this over now to my husband, Guy, who's going to share about what he's doing with the local church in Cambodia, strengthening families and communities through reaching the youth of the country.
As Summer mentioned just a little while ago, the key to this issue and many issues like it is prevention. When you look at prevention, you start to get things like you're building communities. You start to build trust. You start to build awareness of the issue. Infrastructure is strengthened. Police forces, fire, ambulance, all of those kinds of things start to be strengthened. Hope is strengthened. As she said, you can't go on to look at another spiritual paradigm if things are breaking down around you. When prevention starts to play a key factor, hope is risen. And then we can start talking about things like Christianity is included in all of that. So what am I? I'm a youth worker, and I work with the Anglican Church in Cambodia. And as we started to prepare our talk for you guys, we started talking about what does prevention in the youth work realm in Cambodia look like? Well, it looks like strengthening young people. Bishop Grant and Dr. Wendy got up yesterday, and Bishop Grant said, it's about young people. We've got so many young people, and we don't know what to do. It's about strengthening young people. We're working with a problem that stems both ways. You have on one side the perpetrator, and on the other side the victim. And the key here is that at some stage they were all young people. And so what does it look like to strengthen young people in Cambodia, in this country, in New Zealand, in Uganda, in Africa, wherever you are from? What does it look like to strengthen young people? Let me paint you a picture for a second. Come with me on this. We talk about young people or youth or youths or whatever the word is that you use to categorize people from about age 9 through to about age when you get married, or 25 or 30 or whatever it is. Let me paint you a picture. Youth comes from the Industrial Revolution. It's a new thing. The Industrial Revolution kicked off. They started batching young people. They started going to school. They put them in uniforms. They ring a bell at lunchtime. They ring a bell at the end of the day. They're all hanging out together. And they go home, and then they move on, and they go to university together. And they're all batched by ages. And they move together. And after school, they hang out together. Now, when we talk about young people, and when this idea of youth and a bunch of young people hanging out together all day long, we can break them up into subcategories, okay? I'm going to give them to you. So if you've got a pen and paper or a notepad or a phone, and they're not going to come up on the screen, so you can't take a picture. There's these 4 subcategories that all start with C. It's easy, okay? The first one is the category of criminals, okay? The second one, consumers. The third one, clients. And the last one, citizens. Okay? You look at a young person anywhere in the world, and you could probably somehow put them into one of these 4 categories. Obviously, each category has its pros and cons. We look at young people who fit into the criminal category, obviously not ideal. They're involved in criminal activity. They probably end up in jail or whatever it is, or some kind of youth institute. This is not an ideal category for young people to be in. Consumers, right? Industrial Revolution, batching, uniforms, school. income that's expendable, advertising, marketing, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, you can have whatever you like, you need this, you can have that, you've got money to pay for it. Young people get caught up somehow in this consumeristic mindset. Think of it like this. You run a youth program and your young person turns up and they show up right on time and they leave right when it finishes. Consumeristic. Clients, pretty self-explanatory. Summer deals with clients. They come, they're put into your program, they have something wrong with them, you can compartmentalize them, put them in a group, you can track their growth, you can put stats on them, whatever it is. The fourth one, and my favorite, citizen. Citizens, as we know, are part of the community. They give back. Somehow, when we look at young people, we are wanting to work from moving our young people from the first three categories, criminal, consumer, and client, over here to our citizen category, where they are giving back, where they are part of the community, where they are participating, where it's not just about them, but it's about everybody else. Not what they can get, not what they've done, not turning up to some program and being analysed, but how can they give back? That's what it's about. You can see that when we're looking at trafficking, the trafficking issue, we are working with two kinds of groups. Mostly with the criminals, the perpetrator, and then on the other side, the clients, right? That's who you're working with. The goal here would be to strengthen our young people so that they would, in this case, be the young people that fit into the category of being citizens. This is the dream everywhere, but it doesn't always work out like that. And sometimes that's where the reactive NGOs come into play, right? The people who provide the services, the trauma therapy, the shelters, the vocational training, whatever it is. These people are doing amazing work, but on a reactive scale. The idea is to be proactive. Prevention. Now, I want to work through a couple of holistic frameworks with you when we look at the lives of young people. Firstly, I want to bring up a model called the Circle of Courage. Right, on the right, it says belonging. And that is the first part of the circle. Isaac, you can move along. Belonging. Young people want to belong somewhere. There's a quote from Eleanor Delora that says, "Be related somehow to everyone you know." I don't care where you're from, young people want to belong. It's up to us to provide a space that's healthy and safe for these young people to belong. No doubt you're like me and you've looked at, say, something like young people who go into gangs. And you're like, why on earth do young people go into gangs? Why would you want to do that? It's because they don't belong somewhere else, so therefore they feel like they belong there. Someone tells them that they're loved, that they've got brothers or sisters. It's because they're not loved and made to feel like they belong somewhere else that they choose to go and find somewhere else. Belonging is the first one. Moving around the circle to mastery. Mastery looks at the way we deal with young people and the skills that they have. Young people get frustrated in their attempts to achieve if they don't have the right skills. So therefore, they will go off and they will be delinquent about it and use their skills somewhere else. Young people are artistic, they're creative, they want to have an outlet. Are we giving them an outlet for them to be able to use those skills? Third one, independence. Independence is pretty self-explanatory. Young people want independence. They want to be able to go and have independence. If any of you have teenagers or have had teenagers or have children, I've got an 18-month-old and she wants independence. Right? They want it. They go looking for it. Are we giving our young people opportunities to experience independence, to provide leadership, to be able to have self-discipline? Because if we're not, who is? And if no one isn't, if no one is, then they're not getting it and they're going to go and try and do something else. The fourth one, generosity. I love generosity. And you know what? Generosity is always the last one that's strong within a young person. How are we fostering generosity in our young people so that when we get people who come into our programs or our ministries or our congregations who aren't okay, we're providing opportunities for them to care about others, to bring them out of themselves, to stop them looking in and caring about themselves and it's, oh, whoa, it's all about me. How are we giving them opportunities? When they're caring about others, they're lifting themselves up and it's building resilience in our young people. Deuteronomy 6:4 says, O Israel, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words I command to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk with them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Are we walking with our young people? Are we looking at our young people in a way that says, where do they belong? Do they have skills? Do they have independence? And are they being generous to others? We need to be proactive. We need to go out there and be that place where young people can begin to feel safe and to belong and to be accepted. I want to leave you with this. I read a story by a guy called Eddie Bellero. He's a Cree elder from Alberta, Canada. And he said that in a conversation with his aging grandfather, he posed the question, Grandfather, what is the purpose of life? After a long time in thought, the old man looked up and said, Grandson, children are the purpose of life. We were once children and someone cared for us. And now it is our time to care. I challenge you to go out there. And if you're involved in youth ministry or youth work, get out there and get involved and figure out how we can make our young people strong again. How we can prevent the issues from even happening. Because that's what it's all about. That's me. Thank you very much.